The next speaker is Wolfgang Schellenbacher. Wolfgang is an historian at the Documentation Center of the Austrian Resistance at DÖF in Vienna, where he is a project leader of the Digital Archive project Memento Vienna and in charge of the victim databases. Since 2011, he has worked on the research project European Holocaust Research Infrastructure, EHRI, and from 2011 until 2019 at the Jewish Museum in Prague, and since 2019, and we are really proud and happy, he is also a colleague at the Vienna Wiesenthal Institute for Holocaust Studies. Between 2019 and 2020, he worked for the Masaryk Institute and archives of the Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, and his research topics and publications to date have focused on the Holocaust in Austria, digital archiving and online editions, the Theresienstadt ghetto, and Austrians and in exile in Czechoslovakia. Wolfgang, thank you very much for accepting the invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Eva, for the nice introduction and for the invitation so that I can talk here today. In recent years, the Documentation Center of Austrian Resistance, and I will say DÖF from now on, otherwise 20 minutes will not be enough. In recent years, the DÖF has embarked upon a process of geo-referencing the databases of victims. This is not only the result of transnational cooperation, for example, with projects in Prague, but mainly has its root in a shift towards public history and the increased expectations of the users that everything must be available online. We have already seen yesterday that recently several remembrance projects presenting large amount of geo-referenced Holocaust-related data and digital material have been put online. And for the DÖF, that is the case with Memento Vienna. This was such a project, and this was the starting point for us to geo-reference our data. As well as making this historical data available for a broader audience, the project can also deepen the understanding of the Holocaust for historians. Spatial studies and the visual mapping of Holocaust-related spatial data have been proven to be able to lead to new research results. I would like to give you a quick overview of this process in the DÖF and highlighting new research questions by showing map data on the Holocaust. Before I do so, just very quickly, for those of you who are not from Vienna, Austria, just so that you have an idea what we are talking about here, we are talking about numbers of 206,000 Austrians who were now counted as Jews by the Nazis after the so-called Anschluss. 135,000 of them approximately managed to flee, or to be more precise, were expelled from Austria. And 48,000 were transported from Vienna, but all in all, approximately 66,500 Austrian Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, since not everyone who managed to flee also managed to survive, but these people were later on transported from Belgium, from France, from Czechoslovakia to the concentration and death camps. To collect these names, the Documentation Center has started already in 1992 to collect the names in victim databases, and so far we have collected the names of 64,550 people who fell victim to the Shoah, and this is in dozens of different databases of victims. We also have, of course, included names of those who survived, but for privacy issues we are only allowed to put those online who were victims of the Shoah. For the Documentation Center, Memento Vienna was really a way to geo-reference data. For those of you who know this already, don't worry, I'll keep this very short, the introduction to Memento Vienna. Memento Vienna is an online tool designed for, so it's actually a mobile website designed for mobile phones and tablets, and by geo-referencing the addresses of victims of the Nazi regime, so mainly we have done this for victims of the Shoah, but we've also included political victims. You can go through the city and see your own vicinity. As we've just heard, it's handy to have GPS. This is also the case here. You start and see your own vicinity. You can click on a place that has that was the last address for people who fell victim to the Shoah. You get further information about a house, wherever possible, even a photo, further information, and then if you click, then you get a list of these people, and if you press on a person, then you get additional information. So usually at least you get information on the fate. In many cases, you have more documents and photos included with these people. So the idea was really to have a living digital archive with documents dealing with the Holocaust, that buildings and streets become places of remembrance. And it's important to say that this is not a symbolic selection of victims, but this includes all victims from Vienna. So at the moment we have included 55,000 people in Memento Vienna. To do so, it was important to geo-reference our databases so that the city map is the starting point then, and you can search through either houses or also for victims, for names. And by mapping the database of victims, you can also see the addresses, but we also have included places of the Nazi dictatorship as well as Jewish institutions and aid organizations. By showing these places, Memento Vienna also makes visible that after the Anschluss, Jewish spaces started to shrink rapidly. For instance, as we all know, Jews were prohibited to entering public parks, so many mothers brought their children to the only green spaces that were allowed to enter still, which is usually the Jewish cemetery. And with the ongoing revocations of rights, Jewish life also underwent a spatial recentering. And even those who were not religious or those who were now Jewish by race, were now increasingly dependent on Jewish communal institution for immigration or for social or healthcare. This you can see with places all over Vienna, for example, with the soup kitchens of the Council of the Jewish Elders in Vienna. And at the same time, new geographies of persecution emerged. If you think of the Zentralstelle für jüdische Auswanderung, the Central Office for Jewish Emigration. And additional Jews soon were moved to overcrowded apartments in houses that were already occupied by Jews, which led to a kind of ghettoization of Jews in their own city prior to transportation. Obviously, there was no ghetto, but a ghettoization here at this point. And exactly this same data that was used for Memento Vienna can also be used to show this and to map this. So, for example, you can, of course, map the last addresses of Holocaust victims in Vienna due to this data. These are addresses from 1938 of people who later were victims of the Shoah, and you can see they lived in all places over Vienna with a concentration along the Danube Canal in the 2nd district, some areas of the 9th, 1st, 20th and 3rd, but all over Vienna. And if you compare this to last known addresses prior to the deportation in 1941, 1942, you can see how these places shrank. This is quite obvious here, and you can see this also on a much smaller level. So you can really look into certain streets in certain areas of places in Vienna and get further information where there were Jewish houses, for example, where there weren't, and so on and so on. And this also shows the Jews were less ghettoized, but the ghettoization was brought to the Jews. An analysis that also Tim Cole came up with his studies on the Budapest ghetto. Of course, you can use this data also for looking at situation in exile. And let me just start with an example of a person who later on worked at the DÖF for many years, and that is Esther Tänzer. She described in an interview at the DÖF where she lived and whether these areas were Jewish or not, and how other areas were, which is something that you can see very well when you map the data. But she also described how she and her mother and her two sisters managed to flee to Belgium. She said, "I came to Antwerp first. That was such a relief to be free. Nobody thought at all that Belgium would one day be occupied, that the war would continue. We just wanted to be free at last." And the interesting thing is that you can map these people here as well, thanks to the colleagues from Caserne d'Ossat. Verle is here, and also her colleague, Doreen Steven. They had the Left Behind project on forced laborers in Organisation Tod from Antwerp and their families, which were left behind. And we just did some exchange and tried to produce some maps. And you could see very well then that this was important for me as well, because I could see okay, that is the registration address of Jews in Antwerp in 1940, so can I have a look whether we have these people beforehand in Vienna, where did they live? And you can see here that they lived all over Vienna as well, but mainly the bigger points, so when it's more than one person, usually smaller families or bigger families, they lived very much in these Jewish areas that were often rather poor areas as well. So this is just to point out further research should be done on this, that this is rather poorer families. We could also have a look at what about those families who survived later on, where do they live? So that is quite interesting, but it just shows that there's hypothesis of socioeconomic factors. Together with the colleagues from Kaserne Dossin, we also looked where they lived in Antwerp. So for most of you, that doesn't make much sense if you don't know Antwerp. But what you can see is where the Austrians lived here in Antwerp. And if you compare this to the whole of them, then you get the impression that they lived at quite the same area in the city. So before there was a ghettoization or something like this, even here you can see that they lived in very areas where there was Jewish aid organizations and help as well. Her mother and her two sisters, Chana and Chaya, were deported from Mechelen to Auschwitz in 1943. Esther Tenzer herself worked in the communist resistance in Belgium, and in 1943 she was arrested and sent from Mechelen to Auschwitz in 1944. However, she survived. You can see very similar things also for Czechoslovakia, for example, and let me show you this with the example of Ernst, or later Arnošt Löwit. Due to the rapid exclusion, disenfranchisement, and expulsion of Austrian Jews, also he, an Austrian bank assistant born in 1889, was forced to flee from Vienna to Prague. We know that in July 1938 he rented a room in Čermákova 9 in Královské Vinohrady, so the Königliche Weinberge, a rather middle-class, nice neighborhood, and soon became dependent, though, on the support of the Jewish community in Prague. Following the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, he tried in vain to prepare his further emigration to Shanghai. In autumn 1941, he received a summons for a transport from Prague. However, Ernst Löwit was arrested on October 18, 1941, in a cafe on Charles Square in Prague. He had removed his Star of David to meet his non-Jewish fiancée, Ludmilla Klimt, and bid her farewell. She extra came from Austria to say goodbye to him before he was transported. After 2 weeks in prison on November 30, 1941, he was transported to the Theresienstadt Terezin ghetto, and a month later, several inmates in the camp were arrested, Ernst Löwit included, for illegally sending letters out of Terezin. In an exemplary punishment, the SS hanged him together with 8 other inmates on January 10, 1942, a mass execution that was unique in the history of Theresienstadt. The story of Ernst Löwit underlines several aspects of exile in Czechoslovakia. First of all, he, like many other thousands, were fleeing from Vienna to Czechoslovakia in early summer 1938. And we can see how the persecution of Jews under the Nazi regime began in the space of everyday life, so in private homes, in public spaces or workplaces, or in his case, in a coffee house. And we can also see where these refugees lived, like in case of Ernst Löwit in Vinohrady. And of course, we can again map these approximately 2,300 Austrians who were later on deported from the Protectorate, Bohemia and Moravia, to Litzmannstadt and Theresienstadt. And you can see, if you compare this to the data from the Jewish population in Prague, the areas are quite similar, however, not always. So in his area, you can see in Vinohrady, he lived there as well. So that's like the lower line here underneath, where he also lived, and there's some gap in between where usually other Jewish people lived, but then again, close to the Vltava, the Moldau, other Austrians lived again. You can compare this because of a new project called the Memo GIS in Prague that was also based on the success of Memento, and have been working together with my colleagues there. And they have not only mapped the addresses of Jews, but were also able to do something else. They have mapped so-called incidenti, so incidents of arrests, for example, like in the case of Ernst Löwit. And if you compare this, then you see that this is happening exactly where Austrian Jews also who went to exile in Prague lived. So the spaces here overlap and are quite similar. You can, of course, also look at transports from Vienna, and let me do this by the example of Charlotte Schönfeld, who was born in 1922 in Vienna and lived together with her mother and her younger brother in Blumauer Gasse. On February 15th, 1941, she was transported from Vienna to Opole, the first mass transports leaving Vienna, actually, and half a year earlier than in other areas of the German Reich. In March 1941, she wrote to her boyfriend who stayed behind in Vienna. After a 2-day journey, we have finally reached a dump. It's freezing here, there's no food, no way to make an income, no light, so it's simply terrible. We are sleeping on straw in some attics. The Kastelletzgasse, so the Sammellager, the collection camp that she is referring to and was transported from Vienna, she said that Kastelletzgasse was paradise in comparison. And so Charlotte Schönfeld and her mother and her brother who perished in the Shoah also show that the history of the transportation is, of course, perceived very differently from the victims, depending on whether they were transported out of their homes or have been moved already in so-called Jewish houses, in Sammelwohnungen, or they have been transported from Sammellager, which is the first thing that she can relate her experience to. So looking at different transports and transports in different times, you can see, for example, if you do this with the transports to Nisko, where approximately 1,600 Austrian men were transported to in October 1939, that these people came from all over Vienna again, with again a concentration in the areas along the Danube Canal. And these are usually like unique points, so one point stands for one person, since there are no families, but it's individuals. In rare cases, it might be two brothers or like father and son who were transported from. It looks very differently if you compare this to the transport that Charlotte Schönfeld was transported with to Opole in February 1941. These transports come already from these areas along the Danube Canal in the 2nd district, and you can see bigger points and smaller points. So it's families now that were transported from these area. And again, very different that looks if you compare this to Theresienstadt transports, like here, the transport to Theresienstadt on August 20th, 1942. You have very big points, certainly, and if you look at them in detail, you see that the biggest point up there, for example, is Seegasse 9, so an old people's home, obviously, where 98 people of this transports of 1,000 people were transported from. The other one is Zirkusgasse 3, another old people's home. But you can also see bigger points in between, which are so-called shared flats for old people, Alterswohngemeinschaften, where people were transported from. Suddenly you have to have in mind that here you have an average age of 72 years in this transport, so it's like people who were older than beforehand. And this leads us to something else, that age is an important role when it comes to shrinking places. And you can see this very well if you map all of the victims from Vienna by age. So this is a heat map again of people under 65 years of age from Vienna. You can again see this concentration, but however, they lived in other places as well all over Vienna. If you compare this to people who are older than 65 years of age, then this looks very different again. So you can really see that the shrinking place for elderly Jews is much harsher and much more experienced, of course, here than it was for people under the age of 65. This is also, by the way, a question of gender, of course, since rather younger men managed to flee. In return, you have 64.5% of more than 48,000 Austrian Jews who were transported from Vienna were female, which of course also shows you that this is a correlation not only between age but also between gender that needs further research in my point of view. So there's a lot that you can see with this geo-referenced data, and obviously what I've shown you are now research results, but it's just I'd like to do an appeal to use this data that comes out of these remembrance projects for further research into the history of cities like Vienna. The same thing happened now in Prague, and you can see the outcomes already. Thank you very much.